Thank you guys so much for coming out, and hello to everyone on the interwebs on C4DLive.com. Appreciate you all tuning in. My name is EJ Hassenfratz. I am a motion graphic artist from Denver, Colorado, and I also run the website eyedesyn.com, do a bunch of tutorials and stuff like that. And I've been using Cinema4D for about 8 years now. And the reason why is just the learning curve is just non-existent. It just allows you to be an artist and just allows you to be creative and just make stuff. You don't have to be super technical to be able to create stuff in this application. I'm not the smartest guy in the world, so that's perfect for me. So it also allowed me to reinvent myself. So it's very flexible. So I had a couple of years ago, had a heart-to-heart talk with myself about my skill set. And I'm like, EJ, you call yourself a motion designer, but you're not so good at the motion, and you're not so good at the designery part either. So I was like, I need to change that. So what that meant was going back to basics, fundamentals of design. That meant shape, color, form, animation fundamentals, and I wanted to do that in the app that I was most comfortable in, and that was Cinema4D. So for me to be able to improve in that, I was like, I'm just going to go all 2D. I'm going to start making things in 2D, and Cinema4D has such an amazing skill set to allow me to create 2D compositions in the world of 3D. So what I'm going to do now is just kind of show you some examples of some of the work that I was doing over those 2 years to try to improve as a designer and as an animator. So all of that, most of that, all done and completely inside of Cinema4D. So the crazy thing is that I've been posting all this work online and been getting work from that. So it's always like that mantra of create the work you want to work on, which has been really cool for me. And I've also had a lot of After Effects 2D animators coming up to me and is like, that was made in Cinema4D. Like, that's nuts. People don't know that you can do this inside of Cinema4D. And I've always talked to these 2D artists, and I'm like, well, yeah, you definitely got to check out Cinema4D. And I was like, yeah, but it's a 3D application. And one of the biggest hurdles a lot of people have told me for 2D artists trying to go to 3D is just where to start. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to try to help you guys to start getting into the world of 3D. Let me just open up this first animation here. I'm just going to break down just very simply some ways that you can create stuff like this inside of Cinema4D. So we got this globe spinning, all this stuff popping on. I did this in about a day. And I think in After Effects, if you were going to do something this complex, probably take a little bit longer than that. So let's go ahead. And this is the project file right here. You can see all this stuff happening. And if I go into my interactive render region right here, and I'm going to be turning this on a lot, what this allows us to do is see what this is going to look like when it's fully rendered out. So you can see that this is completely 2D. It looks completely flat, but I'm like running around here. I'm rotating around. If I want a different view angle, I could just rotate the camera. Boom, So what I'm going to do is break down how I made this scene very easily. And we're just going to start with how you can get flat 2D looks in Cinema. So I'm just going to create a new composition here. Go into, just make a sphere. There's my little earth. I'm just going to create a new material by double-clicking the material manager here. And I'm just going to apply this material to my object. You can either apply it here or on the actual object in the object manager. And again, I'm going to turn on my interactive region, render region here. And I'm just going to crank up this triangle here. And this is like the quality slider. So if I just bring this all the way up to the top, we're going to see what this is going to look like when it's fully rendered. And I'm also going to right-click on this triangle and just go to alpha mode so I can just see my grid behind that. So what I'm going to do is just double-click and open up my default material. And you can see in the material preview window, this is like your diffuse, your standard diffuse clay texture. And what this is doing is just giving that illusion of 3D depth by giving it that shading. So what I'm going to do is just turn off the, so we got our specular and our diffuse in the color channel. I'm just going to turn off the reflectance. I'm going to turn off the color. And where we're going to be living all day today is in the luminance channel. So this is kind of almost like placing a fill effect on any layer in After Effects. It just changes it to that color, and it's flat. So I can change this to any color I want. We're not going to get that diffuse shading or anything whatsoever. I can put a light in my scene even, and that's not going to change anything at all because, again, it's just fully luminant, devoid of diffuse shading. So I don't want a purple earth, so let's get some blue in here. And I have an image from Photoshop that I made that has like the continents on it. So I can turn on my luminance on this as well. I'm going to go to my texture, click on this dots button, and let's see. Go into and find my Earth image. So you can just import Photoshop files. And actually, I'm just going to copy this into my alpha channel. So this is an alpha channel, just like you'd be used to in any other application. Let me just blow this out, and I can change the color here. So this alpha channel, that image, that Photoshop image, is a black and white matte that's just going to knock out the shape underneath it, and I can just apply this to my sphere. Fantastic. And the way that textures work in Cinema4D is that the rightmost texture is layered on top of the leftmost texture. So it's just like layers in Photoshop. You can layer up a bunch of materials, and there's my Earth. And if I want to rotate my Earth, I just hit the R key. If I select my sphere here, hit the R key, got my rotation bands, and I just rotate it. And I think that's the craziest thing is like you can work in full 3D space. If you want to rotate something, you just rotate it. You don't need any kind of crazy expressions or rigs or anything like that. So that's my globe. Let's just go ahead and create my stars here. So I have all these stars around, floating around. We got this really nice parallax happening as well. Everything's rotating and giving that good sense of depth. So let's go and create our stars. And what we're going to do is use the Mograph module. And the Mograph module is so powerful, especially when you're doing things in 2D. It can make animations that would take maybe a day into like an hour, just because you're able to generate geometry so quickly. So I got a cloner here, and what a cloner does is clones any geometry or object underneath it. So I'm just going to create another sphere, place it underneath that cloner, and I'll just turn off let me just name this Earth, and I'll just turn that off for now. So what's going on in this cloner is it's cloning that sphere at a count of 3, and it's moving each sphere 50 centimeters above the other one. So what I'm going to do is just turn down the radius of this sphere to, say, 10 or maybe 7. And let's just make a whole bunch more. So what I'm going to do is, instead of linearly cloning these things, I'm going to make them clone radially. And I'll turn back on my Earth and just make this radius big enough so it's going to just orbit around the Earth. And I'm just going to crank up the count here. Now, so I just easily generated a whole bunch of clones, a whole bunch of spheres. And then what I'll do is just create a new material. And again, I'm just going to turn on that luminance channel, and I'll just put, a white texture on that one, on my stars. Let me just rename this star. And now we can start adding some randomization here. Now, I'm going to go ahead, and we have all these effectors here, and they're super useful. We have the random effector, which I'm going to give some love in this presentation because I've neglected it for a while. And I'm just going to apply this random effector to that cloner. You can see in the effector menu here that's applied to this cloner. And what that's doing by default is is randomly moving all of these clones, these spheres, in the X, Y, and Z 50 centimeters. And I can crank this up a little bit in X, Y, and Z. And you can see that I just totally created this whole like star field kind of thing. I can also enable the scale and add some like random scaling to this as well. So just super easy. It's kind of like particular, but you don't need a plugin, and it's fully 3D. If you want to rotate around, we get this really nice parallax in here. You really get that sense of depth. And another thing we can do is easily animate this stuff on. So if we want to animate all this stuff on, we can do this very procedurally by going to our Effector menu, getting our plane effector. And what the plane effector does is affects all these clones, position, scale, and rotation. So you can see that by default, it's actually moving all these clones in the Y. And what we want to do is actually not move this at all. We just want to scale these down. So I'm just going to activate the scale, go to uniform scale so we can scale uniformly. And I'm just going to put -1 as a value. So all of our stars are going to be scaled to nothing. So the fall off is set to infinite. So it's affecting all of our clones at the same time, all at once. But we can go ahead and choose a linear fall off. And I can change the orientation to like -x. So it's going to be facing to the left, or -x. And I can, if I get out of my interactive render region here, let me actually turn on my deformers here. There we go. So you can see visually the fall off is this linear plane. And as I move this through my scene, I'm scaling all this stuff up. Now, I think if I have anything to say about After Effects is I wish something like this was in After Effects to be able to animate all these things so easily. So to animate all these things on, I'll just go ahead and just hit a keyframe in the X and just move this over and move this to the right, set another keyframe, and just hit play. And you can see I just animated all of my spheres on, and that took 2 keyframes. So this is just simple stuff. This is the basics of Cinema 4D, and it's not difficult. It's not very technical at all. I'm visually animating. I got my visual linear fall off here. And there's all this other cool stuff you can add on top of that. So I have this random effector here. So not only can we randomize like the position, the scale, and the rotation of these things, we can actually randomize how these things are being affected by that plane effector. And as that plane effector is coming through and scaling things up, we can actually affect that and maybe make it a little bit more organic looking and not so uniformly being just scaled up. So what we can do is is mess around with this weight transform strength. And you can see as I crank this up, you're seeing spheres pop up before the plane effector even makes it there. And what this does is basically, if you think of the plane effector affecting our clones at just a linear gradient, adding that weight transform is kind of like adding noise to that gradient. So it's adding a little bit more organiciness. That's a word I like to say that I made up. Organiciness to this animation, right? So we have a lot more, it looks a little bit more interesting. So that's adding the random weight. We can also add some like springy, boingy, like expressive movements as well by using probably one of my favorite effectors is delay effector. And you can see that we can affect the position, scale, and rotation. And in those 3 parameters, we can either blend or smooth out, like kind of like extreme easy ease some of this animation in, or we can add a nice springy effect. And you can see if I really crank this up high, you can see this really nice poppy, springy, boingy motion. And again, no added keyframes, we just add an effector to that. So again, just very simple stuff that allows you to make really cool 2D animations super quickly. And you don't have to like create a bunch of shape layers and duplicate all of them and add those keyframes, the like easy ease and the spring and all that stuff. So here's what that ended up looking like. You can see in my scene here that I actually have 2 plane effectors, and one's passing through my globe and is popping up all those little like marker circles and stuff like that. And I have another one that's actually animating them off. So I have one scaling them up, one scaling them down, kind of like wax on, wax off of all these spheres here. And what I'm going to do now is talk about these little clouds here. And I don't know if you can really tell, but they have some like nice undulation movement on these little guys. So let me just go ahead and open that up. There we go, clouds. So there's my cloud, and I put cutesy eyeballs on it because that's just what I do. If you see in my reel, I put cutesy eyeballs on inanimate objects. I just can't help it. I can't help myself. Yeah. So here is my cloud, and you're going to notice that I'm moving around in my scene, and the cloud's always facing the camera. So it's just like in After Effects where you can actually have a layer, a 3D layer and 2D plane in 3D space always face that camera. So you can do the same thing using what's called So you can see that I just got rid of some tags there. Now I can see that that's just flat, and I actually didn't position my eyeballs correctly. He's like bugging out here. But what I'm going to do is just right-click, go to Cinema4D tags, and we have a look at camera tag. So what that's going to do is just simply have this always face the view that you're looking through. And if I have a camera in my scene, and I click this little viewport icon so I can actually look through that camera, it's always going to face my view. So that's very useful when you have like that scene where you have clouds moving around, but you always want it to face forward and towards the camera so you don't lose that nice flat 2D look. So you can see that I have this undulation. This mouth's kind of going crazy. So I'm just going to, he's got no mouth. He can't talk. Clouds don't talk anyways, unless you had a little bit too much to drink in Vegas. So what we're going to do is I'm going to show you how we can create this nice undulation movement using a super powerful tool called the Pose Morph Tag. Now, the Pose Morph Tag, when I learned about it, totally changed the way I work in Cinema4D, and the concept's just very simple. I'm just going to go and right-click on this spline. So I have this extruded spline that's making up my, my cloud. So you can see my spline right here. If I go into point mode, you can see this is just a path, like an After Effects path, right? And I just extrude that to get that geometry, and that's nice and flat. So what I'm going to do is I want to just animate the points on this path that's being extruded. So I'll go right-click to Character Tags and go to Pose Morph. Now, how the Pose Morph works is you can morph between different poses or different positions of how your objects in your scene. So you can mix different properties like position, scale, rotation. You can see points here. So what I'm going to do is just click that, and I just want this to store the point information of each pose. So when I go and I select the points, I can then go to my tag, and you're going to see I have a base pose that is just the pose that it's currently at, and then I have this brand new pose that is created automatically that I can then morph into. So what I can do with this pose, this new pose selected, and I'm in edit mode, is I can just start messing around with selecting these points and just moving them around. And you can notice that I'm actually moving with this, this axis handle selected, so I'm not moving this in Z space or anything like that. I'm constraining it to the X and Y plane. And you can see I can just edit all these Bezier handles and just try to make a nice undulating cloud kind of, so this looks a little bit more puffy. So we're just moving all these points around, and what's happening behind the scenes is all these moves that I'm making, all these edits are being stored in this new pose. So if I go ahead and go to the animate mode and I just move this, you can see that I'm actually morphing between that initial state and then that pose state that I just changed. So to animate that nice undulation, all I have to do is animate this pose's strength. So we can have a ton of poses and get way more complex than this. But just for simple like spline animation, we're not animating individual points and having like an individual point animation track. We're storing all of them, right? So I'm just going to hit a keyframe. Let's actually go to frame 0 instead of keyframe. And then let's go to frame like 30. And I'll just crank down this strength to 0. And I'll go to my timeline here, and you can see there's my Pose Morph animation track. And if I twirl down, you can see my animation curve. So if you know how to animate in After Effects, you can animate in Cinema4D. If you know how to animate in anywhere, you can animate in any other app. So here we go. You can see that I just have this morphing happening. And what I want to do is have like an After Effects ping pong loop kind of thing. So I can do that very easily. If I click on the actual animation track itself, so the pose strength, we have all these track options. And we have before and after. And what this means is that after this last keyframe, what happens? Well, by default, that value just stays constant, just like in a normal keyframe in After Effects. But if I want to loop it or have like a ping pong effect and be able to loop that, I can just go and choose a different option here. And oscillate is basically that ping pong where it's just going to go back and forth between those two values. And you can see that added this new curve. So you're going to see that it only actually added one repetition. So to be able to have this loop throughout the whole animation, I'm just going to crank up the repetition so it fills out the full 90 frames of my animation. So I'll put 3, and that should work. So you can see that if I play this, it's just going to loop and ping pong back and forth between those two values. I can select these curves and maybe smooth them out a little bit more. Or if I want to speed this up, I can do that as well. And you can see I'm just looping back and forth between those two states. So Pose Morph Tag, and that's just just scraping the surface of the Pose Morph Tag there. All right, so let's move along to the data center part. So this part right here, we got these little data center things kind of popping up all nice and happily. So we have our little data center here. And the one thing I want to cover is, I'll first cover how I got the all the little LED dots, like the dots changing color on this part. So that was just done very easily using the variation shader in Cinema4D. So it allows you to color clones and objects with just one shader. So what I'm going to do is, I have all these disks in my scene, and I want to select them all and apply a new material to it. And one little workflow thing that I love using is called the selection object. And what the selection object does is allows you to select a bunch of objects and store that selection for later, so you don't have to go back and keep selecting and reselecting all those objects. And this is used a lot in like character animation and stuff like that, but I use it a lot in just my day-to-day workflow. So I have all my disks in here, and I'm just going to say restore selection, and it will select all those objects in my scene. I can make all these edits, and if I do something else, I don't have to manually select all those again. I can just go back up to my selection tag, or my selection object, and just restore that. So let me just show you how that's set up. It's very easy. So you just basically select all the objects that you know you're going to want to keep selecting again and again and again, and just select them all. And we're just going to go, and once we have all those things selected, so I have 5 elements selected, I'm going to go to my Select menu, go to Selection Filter, and just say Create Selection Object. And at the top of my scene, we have this selection, and those objects, those 5 elements, are now in that. So if I deselect and I'm doing other things, I'm like, I need to go back to and select all those things, just restore selection, and it just brings those back up. So super handy work hack there. So I'm just going to select all my disks again, and I'm just going to right-click and just hit Apply, supply this new material. And then I'm just going to go into Interactive Render Region again, crank up this triangle, and go to Alpha Mode. And we have all of our little circles have this just gray material on it. Again, it's loaded in the Luminance. So I want to add that random color, but based off a color scheme that the client wanted me to use. So what I'm going to do to randomly apply those colors to these circles is go ahead, go to Effects and Variation. And by default, if we go into our variation shader, it's going to add like, it's almost like Easter happened on this. We have all these like pastel colors. And what I'm going to do is just change a few things so I can use a gradient to actually define the colors that I want to use. So what I'm going to do is just crank up the gradient blend, and I'm just going to turn off the random color. I don't want any random colors at all. And you can see that now I'm actually getting random samples from this gradient. And what I'm going to do is that the colors are kind of faint. What I need to do is go to the gradient mode and just say replace. And now you're going to get that full value of the colors from this gradient. So one thing you can do with gradients is change the interpolation between these two color chips. So I can just, instead of a smooth interpolation, I'm just going to turn to none. So what's going to happen is that we're going to go from blue all the way to white and no interpolation, no middle light blue values at all. So you can see that just those two colors are randomly being applied to all those circles. So what we can now do is, I already have a gradient here that, these are the colors, the branding colors that I needed to use. So I'm just going to copy that gradient, paste it into this gradient, and you'll see that now all those colors are applied randomly to all of my circles here. And you can change the probability or how much randomness there is. So you can see as I bring the probability down, we're all just using a white sample. But if we crank up the probability, we're going to have more randomness sampled from this gradient. And the great part about this is if you want, say, more yellow to show up, you just make sure that more yellow is actually taking up more space on your actual gradient here. So the cool thing about this is that I had like all the lights kind of blinking and changing colors. All I had to do that was just keyframe the seed. And that's how I got that nice blinking animation. So you just had like stop, hold keyframes, and just did something like that. So super easy, variation shader, just quickly apply different colors to your objects. So I'm going to cover now probably one of my two favorite deformers. And one is the squash and stretch deformer that has this really nice, playful, expressive animation. It's kind of like using the puppet tool in After Effects. And how you use the squash and stretch deformer is you just grab the squash and stretch deformer here. It's very aptly named. It does what it says. I'm just going to place this in my hierarchy, and what I need to do is just zero out the coordinates here. So I'm going to hit Shift-C to bring up my commander, and this is great to just be able to select different commands and stuff like that. So I just want to do Reset PSR, so I'll just type in Reset PSR and just click that, and I now have my squash and stretch deformer right here, and you can see that I have this like purple bracket. So what I need to do in the squash and stretch deformer is basically define where the bottom of my object is, and as I adjust the bottom here, you can see that's bringing up that bottom bracket, and if I adjust the top, I can adjust and define the top of that object there, and then to control the squash and stretch, I just adjust this factor. So to have like a nice expressive movement, all I have to do is keyframe this factor. But what if I want to actually have this squash and stretch and be anchored from the bottom? Right now, it's squash and stretching from the middle, which sometimes you might want to do. But like in After Effects, if you do that scale, you then have to adjust and position down so it actually hits the floor. So to do that, so we don't have to keyframe the position or anything like that, we're going to actually bring up the bottom all the way up to 0. And then what I'm going to do is just bring this down in space so my bottom bracket is actually at the bottom of my object. And then all I have to do is reposition this top so it's at the top of my object there. So now when I do that factor, it's actually squash and stretching and anchored at the bottom. So you can have this cool bouncy movement as it springs up. So squash and stretch deformer, really, really cool. Really cool to add some nice expressive movements to objects. Let's go ahead and so that is just making stuff with just flat luminant textures. So here's Link's cousin Blink, who had way too much coffee, and you can see that this is made just entirely of luminant materials. Again, we are living in the Luminance channel today, and so that was first step. But what if we want to do more cell shading, more anime, more cartoony type of looks? Well, this is really where I have a lot of fun making 2D in Cinema4D, and that is using the cell shader. So you load up the cell shader in the Luminance channel, again, because we don't want any diffuse shading at all. So I'm going to go to Sketch and Tune, Cell, and what's going to happen, it's going to apply this gradient blue texture to my object. And right now it's using the camera as the light source. So you can see that this gradient, as I move these chips around, it's actually changing how these colors are being applied to the contour of my 3D object. So if I want more lighter colors here, I can just move this chip to the left, and you can see a lot more of that lighter blue. So I can also use lights in my scene. So I'm just going to turn off camera so I'm not using the camera as a light source, and use an actual light. And you can see I have my light right down here in my scene. And the great part about this is that as I move this light, it's going to actually update the shading on this actual object, which is really, really cool. So you can just kind of see what looks good. I can also turn on ray traced hard shadows, because you don't want soft shadows for a cartoony kind of look. So ray traced hard, and I can turn on shadows on my cell shader, and you can see we added this nice little shading right there, nice shadow shading. We can also do specular highlights here as well. You can see some nice specular highlights. And we can add and take away as much of the gradient knots as we want. So maybe we don't want a tritone gradient, maybe we just want two-tone. But one handy workflow tip that I like to do is I like to create one cell shader and have it control the cell shading of all the objects in my scene. So I have these two other materials, the teal and the orange. So what I want to do is not use a color, but just use grayscale values here. So maybe like a middle gray, and then I'll just use like a very light gray, like just off-white, and just have that. And what I'm going to do is go back into my Luminance channel and just change this mix mode. You can see I have that original skin color there, that tan. I'm going to change the mix mode from normal to multiply, so just like blending modes in Photoshop or After Effects. and it's going to multiply that cell shading onto that color. So what I can now do is use some very, very simple Espresso. And Espresso is like After Effects expressions. And if you don't use Espresso at all, you need to be using this simple one. And it's called Set Driver, Set Driven. So what I want to do is have this texture from this skin material drive the texture fields on the luminance channel of these other two teal and orange textures. So what I'm going to do is just right-click on this texture, on that the tan color, and just say Set Driver. I want this texture and whatever happens in this texture field, which holds the cell shader, to also be applied to these other materials. So on these, the teal and the orange, I'm going to right-click the texture, go to Expressions, Set Driven. So what's going to happen is, boom, we now have the cell shading applied to the other two colors, because on these other two colors I also have that multiply blend mode as well, so that underlying color is showing through. So now I can go back to my original skin color, go to my cell shader, and just start messing around with things, and it's going to update all those other materials and all the other cell shading on those other materials here. So that's like the easiest Espresso. You know, it's like a pick whip in After Effects. Like, that's easy enough to learn, right? So it's just exactly the same thing. And you can see, once we did that Set Driver, Set Driven, it created this expression null and it added this Espresso tag. And we can actually see what's going on behind the scenes. And basically what's happening is just, it's saying this texture right here, this skin material texture, is just being fed into the orange texture node. So super easy, and it does that all for you behind the scenes. You don't have to be a rocket surgeon to figure that stuff out. You know, it's just all done behind the scenes. So now, again, we can start messing around with all this stuff, and it's affecting all this, all the cell shading on my object. So one thing I like to do is just try to get more stylized cell shading looks. So maybe we don't want hard interpolation. So just like we did with the gradients before, where we can change the interpolation. Currently there's none, so we have no interpolation or no smoothing between this gray value. And let me just make this a little bit darker so you guys can see it a little bit clearer. We can change this interpolation to, say, smooth knot. And we can get a little bit more of a smooth type of cell shading. Depending on what we want, we can bring this little middle diamond part here so we can have like a sharp and then just a little bit of gradation there. So you can get really creative with super stylized looks here. We can even add like a tritone shading here as well. And maybe we want like a really sharp cell shading there, and maybe this kind of smooths out between these gray values and all the way to white as well. And then maybe we want a tiny, tiny specular highlight there as well. So you don't have to just, you know, I see a lot of cell shading out there that's just two-tone, but we can push it a little bit further. So one thing I like to do as well to kind of add really cool creative looks is utilize this bump channel and add a little bit of bump noise to this scene. So what I'm going to do is go to noise and just add a little bit of noise to the bump channel. Bring this down to, say, 20%. Go to my luminance channel. You can see that no bump is actually shining through at all. And what I'm going to do is just turn on this use bump. And you're going to see this kind of gives some like stubble or something to Link. And so I just need to bring down this global scale a little bit more. So maybe just like 5. And then we can bring this strength down. So we got this nice like grainy cell shading kind of thing going on. And what I want to do is, again, we can use that set driver, set driven a little bit. Go to set driver again, just same workflow, set driver on that texture, and set driven on the other bump channel, and just turn on the bump channel on both of these. And you see we added this really cool grainy effect to the rest of our textures. So really cool stylized stuff. We're really pushing what the cell shader can do here. So let's go ahead. And so that's like cell shading. So that's one part of the equation. The other part is cartoony outlines. So I'm just going to open up a new composition here. Let's go to stylized lines. Here's my little coffee cup here. I'll go into interactive render region. So I have this really nice cartoony outlines here. So Sketch and Tune is like two things. One is cell shading. The other is putting cartoony outlines on everything as well. So I just want to really demonstrate again the difference between how different types of cell shading can be. So I made 4 different types of cell shading. And what I'm going to do is use the material override. And what that does is it's really cool to like test out different materials. And what it's going to do is just override all the other materials in your scene by just dragging and dropping them into this custom material in this material override. And you can actually exclude materials as well. So I'm excluding the little irises. And again, I love putting eyeballs on things. So here's an eyeballs on a coffee cup. So what we can do is just, that's the tritone cell shading. I can go ahead and put just that regular 2-tone cell shading on there, completely different look, different feel. We can do the soft cell shading, again, subtly different. And then just soft tritone, where it's a little bit more of 3 gradient knots and a little bit smoothing in some areas and not others. So really cool stuff. So let's go ahead and let's just delete this sketch. Let's go into the sketch material and go into the thickness. And you can see we just have like even weight to our lines, which, you know, if you want to do that, that's cool. But we can push that the lines a little bit further, add a little bit more stylized. And what I like to do is adjust the screen angle, and you can see what happens if I just really crank this up. We have this Spline Editor here, right? And this is kind of how the screen angle works, is you can see as our lines are vertical, or our geometry is vertical or horizontal, it's controlling the thickness. So more of our horizontal lines are thinner, but all of our vertical lines are thicker. And again, we can adjust that by adjusting this Spline Editor here as well. So we can get some cooler, like cartoony, like comic book kind of styles, and just add a little bit of variation thickness there. We also have all these other options in the thickness as well, so maybe we want to use noise to drive all this stuff as well. And have a really huge noise scale up. We can make a little bit of smaller noise. You can see that's almost like a marker kind of thing, or like a scribble, like the After Effects scribble effect. So really cool stuff here. So just like we can push the cell shader to get more stylized looks, we can also do the same thing with using strokes in Sketch and Tune. So this next project was really cool to work on. I did this with the guys at Mograph.com and David Ariev. We made a whole ton of visuals for Deadmau5. And you got to hear the story of how they actually landed this gig. Deadmau5 is a huge Cinema4D fan. So we got some celebrities in this community, which is really cool. So they were live streaming on Twitch, working for like 48 hours straight or something nuts. And you know, I was in the chat room on Twitch, like just watching what they're doing, how they're working. And they're like, oh, you got to do your Sketch and Tune stuff, because, you know, I'm known for the 2D style. And so I was like, all right, I'm going to do it. And this is where I came up with this kind of like spazzing out electro techno kind of Deadmau5 here. And then we have, that's actually the Katy Perry shark, the left shark. Yeah, he's just hanging out, drinking a beer with Deadmau5. I have no idea what's going on in that scene. But let me just break down how I did that. It was very, very simple. So here I have just a sphere. And what I'm going to do is just delete those lines that are on there. So I have my cell shading here, again, applied to the Luminance channel. And what I'm going to do to create outlines is go to, I'm just going to apply the Sketch and Tune effect. So I'm going to go to Effect, Sketch and Tune. And 2 things happens when you actually apply the Sketch and Tune effect to your scene. Number 1, it's going to apply a background color. And I'm just going to turn that off. And it's also going to quantize the shading in your scene as well. But I already have a cell shader, so I don't need to actually quantize any of the shading. So I'll turn that off as well. And it'll add this sketch material. So just like the sketch material we used before where we're adjusting the thickness, we can do the same thing in this one as well. And we're not going to see it very well because it's a black color. So let's go in here and just change this white. So we can now, and this effect is applied globally, but if we want to actually have object level control on sketch materials, we can just drag and drop this sketch material like we would any other normal material. And we have access to all of these different line types. So you can see that the folds, creases, and borders effectively creates an outline around this object. So One line type that's super, super fun to play around with, and I just did a tutorial on my site a few weeks ago about this, but it's the contour option. And this is super cool, and this just applies contour lines to the contour of your object. So what we can do is adjust this based on like the object X or object Y, so we can have horizontal stripes. We can adjust the steps, which is just how many of those contour lines are on our object. We can adjust the variation. It'll add a little bit of random movement to that. But the one thing that was really cool to be able to create like these lines kind of going over the contour of that dead mouse head was going into the sketch material here. Let me actually just use object X. So they're kind of going off to the side here. And I'm just going to go into the thickness and use a texture map to adjust the thickness of these contour lines. And I'm just going to go to projection, not UVW, but just frontal, just so it's a flat noise. And I'm just going to load up a noise shader in here. And you're going to see that that noise is now driving the thickness. And that's like just go into the brightness here and the contrast and just make a little bit of some gaps here. And I can go, and the coolest thing about this is now I have these like chunky lines, right? If I want to animate these lines to go across the contour of our objects, all I have to do is adjust the offset. And we have these lines kind of traveling over our geometry. So we get some really cool, like almost particles floating over our objects. And that's how I created. Let me actually open up the actual finished file here. So here's that actual file. You see we have the spazzy lines going, but there's all those contour lines on the ears and on the face there. So let's go over the little spazzy line things that were happening there. So I'm just going to turn off this thickness and maybe just make this a little bit thinner. And I'm just going to go into the Distort tab, and I'm going to turn on Curve Stroke. And it doesn't really, like, the description doesn't really sound like it's doing what it's doing, but really what's happening is we're curving the stroke, but we're curving it based on noise. So we can actually have like a sine wave, so we can have like an actual even sine wave going over there. And this is all controlled by this display, so we can have this really spaz out or not at all. So what I did to create that like spazzy movement that would happen when like the bass hit really loud was I just chose a noise. And we have different looks depending on what kind of noise you want to do. We can crank up the scale here. Maybe just crank it up pretty high, so maybe like 2,000. And I just keyframe that displacement amount from 0 to some high value to create that nice spazzy movement. So that's just like touching just skimming the surface of what you can do with line types. I have a few other examples here that I'm not going to cover in this presentation because I have some tutorials on this on my website, eyedesyn.com. But I modeled this off of a scene in Ghost in the Shell, the new movie that just came out, where they have this like scanning thing. So again, you can make out these contour lines, and actually every line in the scene is some form of contour line. We also have like dotted lines that we can do, and that's kind of how I made some of those more stylized kind of things. So if we go to strokes, go to pattern, we can add nice little dashed lines. Let me actually turn off the distort here, and you can see that. So we have dashed lines. We can scale down how that is. We can do dotted lines. So really cool stuff of things you can do, as well as this. I did some chalk outlines as well. For an educational video that was really, really cool and fun. And again, this is the power of making things in 3D, is that we can add this nice rotation. Now, if we had to do this kind of rotation in a 2D application, we'd have to manually keyframe all that, right, to get that perspective. So that's kind of the power of building something in 3D. And again, if I just open up this microscope file, this is very simple geometry. Like, I'm not a modeler at all. These are just, cylinders and just basic parametrics, like just little discs here and cylinders and cubes and a sphere here. Like just very simple stuff, and then you apply that outline type, and we got this really nice chalk material. So if you want to learn how to do that, check out my tutorials on eyedesyn.com there. We just got a few more minutes here. Let's do another stylized kind of look, and we're going to get Bodie McBoatface up here. What I like to do is add ambient occlusion to objects to add like nice little grain, just like we did in the bump channel there. But what ambient occlusion does, if I go into interactive render region here, is applies nice little grain to all the nooks and crannies of this object. So ambient occlusion tries to recreate the shading that happens, the real life shading that happens when two objects are really close to one another and they kind of self-shade or shade each other. You can see in the nooks and crannies of where this mast is, we have nice shading, but where there's just open space and open geometry and there's no objects close to it, we really don't have that kind of shading. So this was super easy to do. All I had to do is go and just add an ambient occlusion effect. And what this does is just adds like a nice smooth ambient occlusion. What I want to do is just bring down the samples very low so it's more noisy. And then we can adjust the contrast here to really get that popping a little bit more, and maybe adjust the maximum rain length, which is just how far that is spreading across your object. So instead of 100 centimeters, we just want it to spread 30 centimeters. And then we can change the color, so maybe we want a little bit of some blue noise. So just a click of a button, adding some ambient occlusion, adds some really cool stylized effects to your object. Here's another example of that as well. And this is a flag that I did for a mobile shopping app for Election Day or something like that. Something presidential, but I did this little flag, and you can see I added these really nice. So I have the cell shading, but on top of that, I have that nice ambient occlusion happening as well. So let me just go and open this file real quick. And you can see, I'm just going to turn off ambient occlusion just so you can, cool. So this is just with the cell shading, right? But if we turn on that ambient occlusion, and again, just adjusting the sample so it's very minimal, and changing that color to blue, and again, adjusting so just like with the cell shading, we can adjust the colors, and that color will show up a little bit more on this object. So you can see that as this is rendering here, we're getting this really, really nice grain happening on this flag here. And just by turning on the ambient occlusion, we have some really, really cool grain effects. And I know in After Effects, if you want to apply that type of grain, you actually have to like mask out on your object where everything is. But in Cinema4D, you just turn on the ambient occlusion. We have this really nice stylized grain effect to our flag. And I'm butting up against the end of my presentation, but hopefully you guys are inspired to try Cinema4D a little bit more and kind of be exposed to how easy it is to create 2D in 3D, and maybe think the next time you got to do a 2D animation, you come into Cinema4D and start playing around, because I love it. I have a lot of fun in there. So again, my name is EJ Hassenfratz. You guys can find me on eyedesyn.com, and again, I have those tutorials that I mentioned. So here's that one of that Ghost in the Shell HUD effect. And then I also have the chalk outlines as well. And I have a ton of, if you want to get into Sketch and Tune, I have like 20 or more different tutorials on Sketch and Tune and animating, and here's a little like art shader style stuff. So I just kind of scratched the surface of Sketch and Tune here. But thanks again. Again, my name is EJ Hassenfratz, and thanks for coming out and watching. Appreciate it.